with 72 turns around the sun, I've learned a few things. Part of what cosmology invites us to is the experience of that mystery, that life is a mystery, that personality is a mystery. We can't really comprehend it. And so to allow that mystery to inform us. Wow, look at that image. Knowing that I'm sure you've seen some of these images before from George Park and others, but that every one of those sparks of light is a galaxy, hundreds of billions of stars, and that we're just one of those galaxies. And here we are rotating in some fashion, which I will leave to Nigel and George to let us know how it is that we're rotating through this vast cosmic dance of the universe, but to realize that we have a privilege of entering into a conversation about cosmology, which is the study of the cosmos. Pythagoras, I believe, was the philosopher who coined that term and suggested that cosmos means that we live in an ordered universe. We live in a friendly universe. And what we learn from paper 56, which is one of my favorite papers, paper on unity, is first of all that God is unity. That's amazing. And out of that unity comes this incredible diversity of creation of which we are but a part. And out of that comes this evolutionary plan of progressive attainment of which we are but a part. But that this conversation about cosmology is one that we could probably go deeper with. And when we do, we bump up against what we call the divine reality values. And when we bump up against those experientially in our own inner world, in our own personal spiritual experience, we come face to face with the face of God and the awareness of God's presence. So with that, wow, let's begin. So one of my favorite philosophers, I get to teach Chinese philosophy at the University of Nevada, and one of my favorite philosophers is a fellow named Chuang-Tzu. And Chuang-Tzu, I put in the top 10 of the great philosophers of all time. He follows in the tradition of Lao Tzu, a great Taoist. And he said in his writing, someday there will be a great awakening when we know that this is a great dream. Yet the stupid believe they are awake, busily and brightly assuming they understand things. How dense. When I say you are dreaming, I am dreaming too. Words like these will be labeled the supreme swindle. And I want to suggest as we go through the presentation this afternoon, that we're living right now in what we call the postmodern world, which is a cosmology of fear and alienation. Our culture is defined by that fear and alienation, our politics, our religion, our institutions. And we, I think all who are here this evening are experiencing those qualities of fear and alienation and how cosmology informs culture. So we'll be talking about culture as well as we go through this evening. So again, what is cosmology? What is cosmology? It's a universe story, and it's a novel universe story. It's a universe story that should thrill us. It's an intimate dialogue with science, philosophy, and spirituality, but it's confined to no discipline exclusively. It's more poetic than linear, more metaphor than literal in its expression. Cosmology is not only the new story, it is also a new or newly recovered way of thinking, of feeling, and of relating to the universe, knowing that we are of it and not above it, that we are a communion of subjects and not a collection of objects. Along the path, I had the privilege of being the student of a fellow named Thomas Berry, who's written a book called The Universe Story, along with Brian Swim. And Thomas Berry says, importantly, that the universe is a communion of subjects. And that is kind of where we start the conversation about personality. That personality is a deeply subjective reality, and it is approached primarily through our own vulnerability, which we experience in worship, we experience in our study groups, perhaps, circles of trust. we experience when we're able to really humble ourselves and come close to one another and have deep conversation. I love this image of the panda bears. And we ask the question, why cosmology? Why is this important? The Urantia Book suggests that we don't spend enough time with it, that it's a misunderstood topic. But as my teacher Thomas Berry would say, the universe story is our primary reference. The universe story is our primary reference, so we should spend more time with it. All of our reflections, decisions, actions should be in proper relationship to and alignment with the universe story. And all of us on this screen this evening, we're all privileged to have a universe story delivered to us through the fifth epochal revelation. Berry suggests that the great work of our moment, and I hope each of us in our own way is engaged in this, is to ensure a just, healthy, beautiful, sustainable, life-giving world for all future generations. Now, I know it seems a little difficult at this moment, a lot of difficulty, but I, as I tell my students, suggest that we should smile, because what we know and what Albert Einstein asked was the really most important question in cosmology is, do we live in a friendly universe? And what each of us is privileged to know is that we do, and that we can rely upon that. We're sustained and supported by the invisibles, by our unseen friends, in helping to create this life-giving world. So this will require our cosmology drawing from our highest wisdom, which is not just the Urantia Book, but it's, if you will, a variety of different sources. People like Thomas Berry and Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating and Richard Rohr and others who help us to appreciate what awareness is, what consciousness is, and how we can dive deeper into a quality of compassion and how we can draw a quality of courage in our own journeys. The universe is a source of awe, the healing balm of wonder. One of the books that I recommend to you is a friend of mine, Dr. Keltner, who is the director at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, and it's just called Awe, A-W-E. In that book, Dr. Keltner explains that awe is really the deepest source of healing and medicine. Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist, said enchantment is the oldest medicine there is. And so in our approach to cosmology, we should always feel that sense of awe and wonder, that radical amazement that Abraham Heschel speaks of, that sense of joy that we live in a friendly universe and that we are supported. So what is cosmology? It is a universe story. The ancient indigenous traditions, which we'll spend some time with, provided a multitude of universe stories. The Greek Claudius Ptolemy provided a story that gripped Western imagination and our egos for centuries, almost 1,500 years, until Sir Isaac Newton and Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler upended that story with their mechanistic cosmology, only to be upended by Einstein, Bohr, Planck, Eddington, and friends with their illimitable superior intelligence, is what Einstein called it. People often like to say Einstein was an atheist. Well, he's an atheist like I'm an atheist. I don't accept most of the images of God that are out there in popular culture, but I do accept the image of God that we find in the Urantia Book, which I think Einstein would have been very friendly with. And now with the advent of the fifth epochal revelation, the Urantia Book, there's a new vision of a spiritually grounded, supremely elegant, expansive, personal cosmology. The cosmology of the Urantia Book, as you may or may not know, would not have been possible without the work of Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Max Planck, Edwin Hubble, who's sitting there in front of his Hubble telescope, Sir James Jeans, Marie Curie, and so many others. It would not have been possible. So we give thanks for previous cosmologies, for previous perspectives on how the universe is ordered. Einstein suggests that there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. Cosmology is best conveyed through story or myth, through a meaningful narrative which speaks to the present moment, answering the big questions, the three W's. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? Our question is our personal and collective cosmology in alignment with our personal spiritual experience and highest wisdom? And do each of you, see the miracle? Oh, do you see the miracle all around us? Earlier in the day, I was swimming in the ocean, and I was thinking about the sodium chloride passing through my body. The fact that I am, 60-70% sodium chloride. And so the very seawaters that I was swimming in are swimming inside of me. This is the miracle. It's all around us. And as I said earlier, cosmology really is related to culture. It's important to understand that when we have new cosmologies, we have huge shifts in culture. Culture is shaped by our cosmology. And that's why I'm so hopeful about the fifth epochal revelation. It creates a seismic shift in culture, leading to institutional evolution and progressive civilization. I want to talk a little bit about myth. The neuroscientist Andrew Newberg at the University of Pennsylvania suggests that there's evidence that our brain, our neurons, is a story myth-making machine. That we develop stories or myths to explain reality. We use those stories to explain things we can't really comprehend. Myths help us to understand our universe and ourselves. Myths also show us what is important and what, in terms of the inner life, is deeply and profoundly true. The power of myth lies beneath its literal interpretation, in its ability of its universal symbols and metaphors to connect us with the most essential parts of ourselves in ways that logic and reason cannot. In the Upanishads we read, "Logic takes no person to God." The brain does the best it can at creating a coherent story about what it is processing. The myth helps the brain to respond to the world in effective and adaptive ways. We must always remember that the entire story our brain presents for us about the world is a second-hand rendition of what is actually out there. So in the early 80s, I had the privilege of studying with this fellow, Joseph Campbell, who was the advisor to George Lucas on the Star Wars series. But most importantly, Joseph Campbell taught us all who studied his work about why myth is so important. And he said life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. So part of what cosmology invites us to is the experience of that mystery and the willingness to accept that life is a mystery, that personality is a mystery. In paper 112, that we're told, right, personality is mysterious. We can't really comprehend it. And so to allow that mystery to inform us and to follow the path that is no path, as Campbell says, and to follow our joy, to follow where our bliss, where the synchronicities and synergies and serendipities take us. That is the great adventure. So Joseph Campbell explained that there are 4 functions of mythology, and they provide the playing field of all accessible experience. Edgar Brightman, who is the professor who taught Martin Luther King, suggests that philosophy is really an approach to all accessible experience, and that the first function of mythology is a spiritual or religious function of realizing what a wonder the universe is, what a wonder you are, and of experiencing awe and wonder before this numinous mystery. The second function is cosmological in nature, the dimension of myth with which science is concerned, showing you what the shape of the universe is but showing it in such a way that the mystery again comes through. Myth makes a connection between our waking consciousness and the mystery of the universe. The mystery will always exceed our ability to comprehend it. The third function is sociological or cultural, supporting and validating the social order of one's place within that order. The fourth function is psychological, fostering and centering the unfolding of the individual in integrity, in accord with himself or herself, our society and culture, the universe, and that awesome ultimate mystery, which is both beyond and within ourselves in all things. It helps us pass through and deal with the various stages of life from birth to death. And here's the thing, friends. We all live in a myth. We all live in a narrative. You may think it's literally true, but as we read earlier from Andrew Newberg, it's just an interpretation. We all have our interpretation. I learned a long time ago, even though we read the same book, we have a variety, a diverse approach to that interpretation, which really makes the conversation interesting and the questions very important. So mythology helps us to identify the mysteries of the energies pouring through us. Myths are the clues that unite the forces within us through personality, which is a revelatory concept in the Urantia revelation. Mythology is an organization of images of metaphoric of experience, action, and fulfillment of the human spirit in the field of a given culture at a given time. Myth communicates in metaphor, so it's important for us to learn the language of metaphor. Last night I had a dream, and the dream was as a result of a class that I just recently taught on Christianity with a friend, that I opened the Bible, and there were only 3 words in the Bible. All the rest of the Bible was blank pages, but the 3 words on the first page was, God is love. I think that could inform a whole lifetime and a series of lifetimes. So to learn how to speak the language of symbols and metaphors, by myth we learn to see in those metaphors poetically. We learn that poetry is really the language of the universe. And I don't know if you've experienced it, but the poetry of the Urantia revelation is exquisite. I love it. Some of it's a little more prosaic, but a lot of it is very poetical, and I'm very grateful to the authors for that poetic sensibility. Myth provides a grand frame of reference that facilitates our relationship with the world around and within us, and it facilitates our personal journey, our hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell would call it. Again, we all live in that story, our story. And there is an innate capacity, it seems, as Andrew Newberg suggests, for the mind to form a universe frame of reference, which we learn in the Urantia Book as well, in which to view and filter experience. While such frames of reference are partial and incomplete, they are indispensable maps for human functioning, and they require humility. What history suggests is that all such frames of reference serve as scaffolding and must eventually give way before the expansion of enlarging scientific or cosmic awareness and religious or spiritual awareness, again requiring humility and curiosity, the first 2 of the 8 Beatitudes. As finite, time-bound creatures, our comprehension must always suffer the consequences of our own finitude. That should leave us humble, while on the path of discovering larger and more serviceable frames of reference. T.S. Eliot puts it this way: the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. And so in the following sequence, I'm going to share 5 major moments of the human story, of the plan of progressive attainment on this planet, as history documents it, recognizing that what is provided is an interpretation of those moments. And the moment to follow, the 5th, the moment that is unfolding before our eyes as a result of this revelation, is one of unending discovery and adventure. And we get to be the pioneers of that. How lucky we are. So we go back tens of thousands of years to the Paleolithic stage. Again, living in small groups, tribes. We, again, live in a world in those moments in indigenous culture in which everything is regarded as sacred. There is little or no sense of individuality. That's why you see in the circle, within the circle, a dotted circle. It's a broken circle, which means there's no differentiation between the individual and the world out there. There is a sense of deep interconnection with the seated and animal powers of the earth that dominate human behavior and awareness. In this moment, we're all members of a tribe, and sometimes, occasionally, a federation of tribes. Using Joe Campbell's 4 functions of myth, I'm going to sort of break this down. And again, this moment, the Paleolithic moment, millions of years in the making, represents the wisdom of indigenous traditions across the planet. A wisdom that still filters through our awareness and should filter through our awareness, because as you saw earlier, there's a quality of awareness of the sacredness of all reality. That gets broken up as we progress in the series of cosmologies that we're going to look at this evening. So we see the numinous awe before the great mystery of reality. Everything carries a sense of the sacred, and as Carl Jung again said, only the numinous heals. Only the numinous heals our neurosis. And as I suggest to my students, we all carry a certain dysfunction in our relationships. So we all carry a certain sense of neurosis. The cosmological dimension, the dimension of myth, a multitude of stories come from the indigenous traditions with which we are given a sense of the whence, why, and whither. The sociological aspect, pretty simple. We live primarily in tribes. We moved where the animals, the energy moved. We followed the energy in order to maintain and sustain our own energy. The psychological dimension, the mythic dimension, which through ritual action integrates the individual with the larger whole. Ritual is a subject that has largely been discarded in our current postmodern cosmology, but is a very, very important dimension of the human experience. So again, when we think about indigenous cultures, oftentimes we'll think to ourselves, maybe primitive, but I don't think so. So I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations. This comes from the Bambara people and the astrophysicist Robert Jastrow. So these statements, again, I want you to look and think about, is there some parallelism here? In the beginning, there was nothing, not even space or time existed, according to Jastrow. The Bambara people of Africa suggest in the beginning there was nothing but the emptiness of the void, which they called Fu. Seems somewhat similar. I doubt that any of the Bambara people went to Yale or Harvard or Stanford, but where did they get that perception of cosmology, of the universe? I suggest to you, as Einstein suggested, that imagination is more important than knowledge. That it's through imagination. Imagination is like the greatest of telescopes, the greatest of microscopes, gives us access, which we have lost in the postmodern period, that sense of imagination, gives us access to reality. And then the next couple of statements, again from Jastrow and from the Bambara people. I'll just read the first. Then from a single point came a big bang, an explosion of immense proportions. And the Bambara people, the entire universe began from a single point of sound, the root of creation, yo, 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 yom. From India, we know the sacred sound, the beginning syllable is om. In the West, we have a metaphor of explosions, of grenades. In the East, they have a metaphor of the expansion of energy, of the blossoming of energy, of the singing into creation from the silence, from the depth of silence. These sounds of O or Yom. I'm wondering which metaphor might be more helpful as we proceed. We turn then to maybe 2,500 years ago to 500 years BCE in ancient Greece, the classical worldview. We call it a logos moment. It was called by Karl Jaspers the axial age. It was a period in which all the major religious traditions emerged. We also have the emergence of the individual ego, which is not the person. I want to be clear. Individuality or the ego is not personality. Personality has been obscured by the ego since our beginnings. And this, again, is one of the great revelations of the Urantia Book. So this is a logos moment. This circular diagram, you see a solid circle within the circle. You still see connection to the universe itself. You still see the universe seen as sacred, filled with gods and goddesses who transmit themselves to humanity through nature and the environment, including the weather and human events. What is different is the emergence, still frail, of the individual ego, that thin inner circle. Philosophers and spiritual teachers from East and West are beginning to speak their mind from their individual perspective and personal experience. From poetic bards to prophetic visionaries, such emergent individualism finds its way into the philosophy, art, and technology of classical civilization. Again, the four aspects of that cosmology, of that story, of that myth. The spiritual aspect of the classical worldview is the development of all the major world religions, thanks in large part to the work of Machiavelli Melchizedek and his missionaries. The cosmological aspect that emerged during this time was the Ptolemaic system of the earth at the center of the universe. We can call it an egoic cosmology. The sociological aspect of that classical worldview is the emergence partially out of feudal tribes into empire building. So we have the likes of Alexander the Great and Shi Huangdi, who brought all of the feudal states of China together. We have the likes of Julius Caesar. We have Genghis Khan, a number of individuals who brought empire into our sociological awareness. And then the psychological aspect of that cosmology, of that worldview, was the emergence of the individual ego, a huge step forward. The beginning appreciation of the value of individuation or the possibility of spiritual growth, from the rishis of India to the sages of China to the philosophers of ancient Greece. So the Ptolemaic system, it dominated Western cosmology for 1,500 years. It was, as I said earlier, a geocentric or egocentric worldview. It was a mathematical model developed by Claudius Ptolemy around 150 CE and recorded by him in his Planetary Hypothesis text. The Ptolemaic system is a geocentric cosmology. That is, it starts by assuming that the Earth is stationary and at the center of the universe. The natural expectation for ancient societies was that the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, must travel in uniform motion along the most perfect path possible, which is a circle. In order to explain the deviation from that perfect path, epicycles were created to help explain any discrepancies. Geocentricity, or the projection of the ego, was at the heart of the Ptolemaic system. In the medieval period, this system again shifted, but not too much. It was still Ptolemy, but it provided an appreciation of the location of the heavens, hell, and the terrestrial level, with poets like Dante describing each level in gruesome detail, as he shared in his Inferno, the different levels of hell, and in beatific detail in his Paradiso. We move from the classical period to the medieval worldview. This is, again, a huge shift in cosmology. It's a huge shift in culture. It is a religious moment. It is the ecclesiastical age. This is the mosque in Istanbul, a beautiful, beautiful mosque. And in this circular diagram, we show a universe crosshatched, seen as a place of duality, of heavens and hells, of angels and demons, of saints and sinners, of good and evil. Heresies are to be persecuted, dogmas are to be preserved. The church, the synagogue, the temple, the mosque are the dominant social institutions. All of these institutions informing all scientific, philosophic, and spiritual inquiry. It was a time of heretics and heresies, inquisitions and pogroms, relics and religious orders. Again, the four functions of this story. The spiritual aspect of the medieval worldview was the dominance and power and control of formal religious institutions, East and West, still dominated by that egoic individuality. And so we see a lot of difficulty historically in this period of time. The medieval worldview gives us a cosmological perspective, which we can see through the eyes of Dante. And we can see this three-layered universe of hell, of earth, and of heaven, the celestial orbs surrounding the earth. The sociological aspect of this medieval worldview is an ecclesial society with its belief, with its structure of community, its in-groups and out-groups. And the psychological aspect, the emergence of a religious identity, the idea of a soul that separates communities into us and them, into believers and heretics. And from the medieval worldview, we move to the modern worldview, which is still very much a part of how we see the universe. It is also called the period, the Enlightenment. I remember when I first got to college, I thought, how exciting, I'm going to study the Enlightenment, and thinking that it was a spiritual journey. Not quite so. The profound insight of this moment was that humans, like Sir Isaac Newton, like René Descartes and others, could think the very thoughts of God. This was monumental, and there was a kind of religious sacredness to this period in time, where again, you would be a follower of the Newtonians, or you would be a Cartesian, and you would talk nothing more or less than about Sir Isaac Newton's discoveries of gravitation and how his equation of the mass of one body times the mass of another body divided by the distance between those two bodies squared gives us the force of gravitation. Wow! Newton got into the very mind of God and was able to discern the very thought of God. That was revelatory in this modern worldview. This circular diagram shows a universe stripped of any meaning or soul, a cold and empty space, devoid of significance, increasingly so. Not so much during the time of Newton, but increasingly in the 19th and 20th century and 21st century, we come into this worldview. All meaning, both good and evil, resides in the growing sense of individuality. In other words, it resides only with the human being. The great social institution is no longer religion, but it is science. The rights of the individual to begin to rise above the collective. Democracies begin to form in this period of time. John Locke begins to give thought to the idea of democracies replacing autocracies. Kings and queens and tyrants are deposed only to periodically reassert themselves. The fragility of institutions and systems becomes massively apparent during the 20th and 21st century, as many of us know. Democracy provides a safeguard against collective individualism, socialism and fascism and autocracy. Effective democracies rely upon a solid spiritual foundation. Again, how cosmology affects culture, and culture affects our view of cosmology. The cultural pendulum had swung from a worldview dominated by religious institutions to a worldview dominated by scientific institutions. The curriculum in the universities of Paris and London and Rome and Genoa, the curriculum had swung from theology to natural studies. Instead of religious saints, scientists filled the pantheon, leading to the blessing and curse of materialistic secularism. In this modern worldview, this scientific moment, the Enlightenment, the spiritual dimension was the distancing of God through disenchantment with the fruits of religion. We had religious wars in Europe, some of those wars decimating up to a third of the population of Europe. The emergence of secularism, nihilism, materialism as formal philosophies, deism trying to explain evil in the world by separating God, by moving God away as wholly other, and agnosticism, wondering about the nature of reality. The cosmological dimension, again, the Newtonian system, through the Principia, provides the primary appreciation of the universe, with the discoveries of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo stripping the universe of its sacred sense, the numinous being relegated to the individual or to a specific institution like the Catholic Church. Newton had thought the very thought of God. This was revolutionary. And many thought, why do we need God anymore when we can think the very thoughts of how creation occurred and how the laws of the universe were formed? The sociological dimension, the emergence of empirical sensibilities, the rise of nation states, the evolution of democratic institutions, a movement toward universal education, thanks to John Locke and many others, and individual rights. The psychological dimension of this modern worldview was an increasing scientific inquiry and a skeptical attitude. Facts were the new mystery and the new source of fascination in this worldview. And now we turn to our moment, which, as I share with my students, I hate to be a little pessimistic or a little depressing, but we are living in the postmodern worldview. And the question is whether or not this is a transitional moment, which I know all of us on the screen believe is. Is this the end, as some apocalyptic philosophers and thinkers would say, or is it the beginning of something new? In this circular diagram, we show the individual decentered within the circle of reality, no longer at the center of reality. Reality has been stripped of its sense of the sacred for many. The individual, not the person, is still the source of meaning. Increasingly, there is a sense that facts have been replaced by individual interpretations. Great confusion and alienation abounds. Collective individualism, with the face of fascism and communism, strips the value of the person. The discovery of the collective unconscious by Freud and Jung provides one way forward. There's a growing sense of spiritual growth and disease in a material world that may carry meaning, and that individuation and soul growth may represent an abiding hope. Within the context of the postmodern worldview, there is a distrust of religious institutions, an emergence of fundamentalism in all traditions, incorporating an ideological culture of fear to cement its foundations. Within the cosmological dimension, as you've heard from George and Nigel and others, there's a quantum universe with deep uncertainty. Within the sociological dimension, the emergence of the other. This is huge in the 20th century. The emergence of the other, the ethnic other, the racial other, the religious other, the gendered other, with their rights. System thinking is discounted. And again, the focus is upon other individuals and curiosity and inquiry into the nature of that otherness. The psychological dimension of this period of time is a deep sense of alienation. It is the primary theme of the literature, of the art, of the postmodern world. And there's a deep sense of distress and confusion as we read in the Urantia Book. There are a few significant thinkers who helped to identify this confusion. Marx had identified alienation grounded in economic disparity. Nietzsche had identified alienation grounded in religious despair. Freud had identified alienation grounded in psychological anxiety. and Darwin had identified an alienation grounded in our biological identity. Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and Darwin had articulated our biological operating system, our dual nature. Their thought gave rise to a generation of personal and collective alienation, which led to not only great confusion, but to immense violence. So in the 20th century, as we read in the Urantia Book, at the beginning of the 20th century, a vast number of people had been killed in violent wars, in pandemics, in atrocities committed by one group of people on another group of people. It was a time of immense confusion and violence, of bias, prejudice, and bigotry. And yet, during this time, there were the likes of Carl Jung and Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Merton and Thomas Berry, Wayne Teasdale, and others, who spoke to a cosmology aware of the former, aware of alienation, but also grounded in the awareness of our spiritual instincts, responsive to the alienation and despair of postmodern thought and culture, and aware that we also have, in addition to our biological operating system, a spiritual operating system, what the Urantia Book calls our dual nature. So when we turn to the postmodern world, we ask again, is this the end or the beginning? And Edward Munch's portrait provides a sense of postmodernism called The Scream. Sartre's plays, No Exit, Flies, Nausea, give a sense of the despair. Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche help to define the philosophical sensibility of Western culture. Nobel Prize winner in physics Steven Weinberg describes it well. The effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy. And so in this moment, there is a deep sense of farce, of tragedy, of the absurd. So what we will call, and what Thomas Berry has proclaimed, the echozoic worldview, is a time of hope and possibility. And I would like to suggest that we're beginning to move into that period of time. The discovery of meaning and value in the person. This shows a diagram in the echozoic, a time in which, again, the meaning and value of the person emerges. The individual is recentered and reconnected within the circle of reality. Reality has been re-enchanted with a sense of the sacred, the numinous dimensions of every facet of reality. Facts, meanings, and values are discovered to be integrated within human consciousness, within the person. There's a growing trust in the friendliness of the cosmos. Persons realize that a contemplative attitude is essential to a meaningful existence, that love, compassion, and hope form the baseline of a progressive civilization of light and life. This is the vision we are given in the fifth epoch of Revelation. We are awakening to our dual nature. I call it the two doors of the game show. And I ask my students, which one do you choose? On the left, fear, anxiety, and anger, which is rooted in our biological operating system, which is rooted in our self-centered ego. It is rooted in systems, institutions of reward and penalty. It is rooted in a culture that is transactional and domination-oriented. Or do you choose door number 2, which illustrates the values of love, joy, and peace, which is our spiritual operating system, which is literally the blue zones. There's a wonderful book called The Blue Zones that describes cultures in which this kind of reality exists. Okinawa, Loma Linda, Greece. These are institutions of systems of restoration rather than punishment, in which I-thou relationships are formed, in which compassion and a partnership culture manifests itself. So there's a huge shift going on in the 21st century, as Thomas Berry suggests. It is the growth of the soul. It is an emerging sense of cosmogenesis. It is a realization, as the Dalai Lama says, that love and compassion are not our necessities and they're not luxuries, and that without them, humanity cannot survive. There is a sense, as we read in the Urantia Book, paper 56, that God is unity, and out of that unity emerges diversity. And out of that unity and diversity emerges evolution or growth, the plan of progressive attainment. And the values associated with those principles are love, compassion, and hope. And the rights of every personality within that context, that cosmogenetic cosmology, is that every person has a right to sacred dignity, to beloved community, and to manifest their unique gift. There are other words that explain unity, diversity, and growth within the context of the cosmogenetic principle, but this is a principle that's grounded in scientific inquiry and in philosophic understanding and in spiritual appreciation, and grounded in four reality axioms which we learn in the Urantia Book: matter, mind, spirit, and personality. In this period, again, there is a time in which we are emerging, a time of mutual respect and support for all spiritual perspectives, the awareness that we are living in an organic universe that can be trusted at all levels, the realization that we do live in a universe that is friendly and supports. The sociological recognition is the interdependence of all living systems, human and non-human. The psychological is a deep sense of contemplative interbeing, the emergence of cosmic consciousness, and the deepening of our spiritual perception of lasting values: truth, beauty, goodness, love, grounded in the integrity and character of the person. So this is the hope of the future. This is the hope of the emerging cosmological appreciation provided by the fifth epoch of revelation. And we learn from every previous tradition, every previous cosmology. We learn great lessons from the indigenous worldview, the perspective of Ubuntu: I am because we are because I am. From the axial age, that there are spiritual values that are worthy of our attention. From the medieval age, that religion is an institution that is here to stay, and we should approach it with a sense of curiosity, inquiry, and wonder. Of the modern age, the appreciation of science and the wonder of facts. In the postmodern age, the awareness of personality, the transcendence of the ego, especially the personality of the other. Revolutionary love, which sees no stranger, tends the wounds of trauma, and is healed and transformed through contemplative practice. It is a time when we learn that personality is the great anchoring of all reality, that it is a spiritual reality reached through our deepest subjectivity, vulnerability, and worship, that God is the source of all personality, the greatest objective reality attained through our deepest subjectivity, that every personality is sacred, that every person deserves beloved community, and that every person has a unique gift that only that person can deliver, and that the pathway to freedom is through the gateway of personality, revealing truth, beauty, and goodness, unconditional love. And so we have a lot to learn from this revelation about personality. We have a lot to learn about the principles of unity, diversity, and growth, the values of love, compassion, and hope. We are moving through a time of distress and darkness into an age of light and life, and we get to be the pioneers of that. My friend Lisa Miller, who's written the book The Awakened Brain, says when we become spiritually aware through synchronicity, and I would add serendipity and synergy, it's a sign that despite the uncertainty, we are aligned with the force of life. So let us be not discouraged. Let us be aware that the revelation of God to the world shall not fail, and that our great challenge is for each of us to achieve better communication with the divine monitor that dwells within each of us. Our greatest adventure in the flesh consists in the well-balanced and sane effort to advance the borders of self-consciousness out through the dim realms of embryonic soul consciousness in a wholehearted effort to reach the borderland of spirit consciousness, contact with the divine presence.
Thank you, Gard. That was really, really great. Wonderful to hear. I think it's something we all need to think about more and more for sure. So, Jeff, please.
Well, Gard, you talked about myths And I would ask the question, are myths cosmologically influenceable, or can they be cosmologically influenced or spiritually influenced? Are we looking at spiritual influence through the ages via the myth? Um, and the other question I would have is you mentioned Ecozoic era, and I understand that to be more of a human to planet relationship. And are we eventually going to move to a relationship between the human and the unchangeable, between human and God? Is that the next step past that? Are we anywhere um, close to making that step?
Two great questions. Thank you, Jeff. So, to answer your first question, myth has always been with us. So, mythos means story. So, a lot of us live with the myth that means fiction. And myth does not mean fiction, it means a narrative. And we need to understand that. Joseph Campbell was quite clear about that. We all live in a metaphor, and that metaphor is always changing. And so our cosmologies are always being reshaped. And they're being reshaped by what we would call auto-revelation. So the auto-revelations that occurred in 150 CE was Ptolemy came along and said, I can explain all this in terms of a geocentric universe. And then we get Sir Isaac Newton who comes along and says, well, we've got a little shift in our perspective here from a scientific standpoint. Things might not be quite the way Ptolemy said, as Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo suggested. Uh, and so again, the story shifts according to the revelatory moment that we're existing in. So the medieval period, everything was informed by the religious institutions and the religious stories. So the Bible was it was the scientific document. And as Galileo once said, the Bible tells us how to go to heaven. It does not tell us how the heavens go.
Yeah.
And so again, we lived in that myth, we lived in that story for a number of hundreds of years until Newton came along and again created this sort of secular scientific shift, this pendulum shift, which was huge because people realized he had actually gotten into the mind of God. And that leads to your second question, which is the Ecozoic. So Thomas Berry's famous book is called The Universe Story. So Thomas Berry's appreciation of Ecozoic as a word is not the planet, it's the universe. And it's the relationship of the universe to the planet and to not only all humans on the planet, but all non-human species. And I think that appreciation from Thomas Berry is a really important one because, as we know, there are capstone species. If we lose the bees, we lose more than just the bees. And so the Ecozoic, I encourage everybody to read Thomas Berry's book called The Great Work because it very much aligns with the Urantia revelation. And I think the work that we as Urantia Book students need to step out of our comfort zone, out of the zone of the revelation into the world. I become part of that conversation because I think the revelation can help inform that conversation. So thank you for those two questions, Jeff, and I will turn to my dear brother, my mathematical prodigy, Phil Calabrese.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Gard. Well, I heard the line, "We live in a friendly universe," and joy is the theme of this Sunday's service at the church that I go to. And it occurred to me during the lectionary on Monday that hope plus faith creates joy. A second thought I wanted to say was our choir is singing in a hymn that's Ubuntu, I am because we are.
Thank you, my brother Phil, and thank you for bringing up joy, uh, because joy, I think, is the keynote to human existence, to the existence of any personality. And as I tell my students, if you're not experiencing the intrinsic reality of joy that is inherent in human personality, you've been swindled. And that's why I gave that line from Chuangzi that we are living in a great swindle. And I would suggest that many of us in the Urantia community, we're not quite experiencing the fullness of that joy. And I invite us, and I invite myself, to experience a deeper level of that joy, because it will be joy that turns the heads of people toward the Urantia revelation. It won't be a recitation of facts. Andre.
What's interesting about your thesis, and what's interesting about this, each stage almost seems to be a counterpoise to the stage before. You know, this medieval stage was, in a certain sense, holding things back by its dualism, but then came an enlightenment, and after the enlightenment of that was the modern age, right? If I'm not getting it mistaken, then in the postmodern, there's a backlash
Yeah.
again, and here there's yet another backlash, and there seem to be such pendular swings in the sociological sense, so that we look at this, and you can look at this stage that we're in, and it's clearly it's always on a knife edge as to whether it's going to, you could say, move forward, but sometimes is it falling forward or whether it falls back. And it's quite remarkable what you've, just by describing it, what you've brought to light. Clearly, the stage we're in right now, and Thomas Berry saw some of this because he didn't just refer to an Echozoic age. You didn't share with us that he also looks at a Technozoic age, sort of the simultaneous counterpoise, and the idea, what are you going to actually pay attention to? And not that the Technozoic age has to be a negative, but it can be a negative if it's purely materialistic. So given what you're seeing, do you have any view as to how this plays out? Well, one last thing, your recapitulation of Ubuntu, and I was curious that you related it to the indigenous age. It almost seems that all these prior ages are always available to us to recapitulate in some way in order to either bolster a position or a narrative that we find is important, or to propel us forward, to aid in that propelling forward. What do you see as maybe the salient evolutionary aspect of propelling us forward that allows the revelation a greater ground?
It's a great question, Andre, and I always appreciate your thoughtfulness in these questions. And unless we have a conversation about cosmology, not just in the current moment, but in those previous moments. And so really the reason I brought forward these 5 periods was to illustrate the ballpark. So we're all familiar with baseball. So the first articulation were the ball players, the individual ego stepping onto the field. The second articulation was the realization that there's a religious dimension to all of this. And that was the medieval period, when the religious institutions dominated culture and the religious texts were viewed as the scientific texts. And so that was, if you will, left field. And then you had right field came in during the modern period when Sir Isaac Newton and Descartes and all the other scientific geniuses laid out the appreciation of a mechanistic universe, which in some ways, soft science, yes, but in some ways is science. M times M2 divided by D squared still is the law of gravity. That ain't changing. That's the very way in which God structured the universe. That's hard science. So we got the other side of the field. And then now we're in a place where we're realizing that we can't just rely upon the religious institutions or the scientific institutions, because at the beginning of the 20th century, a Frenchman named Auguste Comte named the new pantheon. The new pantheon consisted of Sir Isaac Newton, Lavoisier, all the great scientists. He discarded all the religious saints and sages, and said science, progress, is really predicated upon the attainments of science. And then what happened? The greatest scientific achievement in the early part of the 20th century was this thing called the Titanic. It was the greatest mechanistic invention that had ever been created. And what? Behold, an iceberg takes it down. And what? Behold, another 2 years, 1914, the First World War. What? Behold, 1919, the Great Pandemic. What? Behold, the Great Depression. So again, we saw the fragility of those institutions. We saw the fragility of how humanity, when it relies upon its own efforts, comes up short.
Yeah.
And we have the advent of the fifth epoch of revelation, which completes the ball field.
What does it mean to narrative and this moving forward when it is seen by a certain subculture that in order to promote a certain narrative, a great deal of falsehood must be promulgated, and that falsehood acts as a coercive effect on narrative? What do we do going forward, and how do we navigate that kind of milieu?
Part of what happened in the 20th century was you had the greatest appreciation of Jesus' message. Paul Tillich said he stood in the rail yards of Germany and he watched as train car after train car filled with the books of a wonderful German theologian declared that the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, was the essence of Jesus' gospel. It was a book called The Essence of Christianity. And then you had the First World War. And then you had neoconservatism. You had Karl Barth, who fell back on a theology of fear, of fundamentalism, and that fundamentalism grew wildly, both within the Protestant and the Catholic traditions. And so because of the implosion and the realization that human culture is not sufficient unto itself, we had a huge sort of devastational moment in the postmodern period where, again, the existentialists were calling it farce and tragedy and absurd, and the painters were giving us images. I don't know. It scares me when I go into some of these modern museums to see some of the images. But the literature was filled with depression and alienation. Why? Because we came to a point where we realized that we by ourselves could not make it on our own, that we needed to rely upon a higher authority, a higher source of reality, which is exactly what we got in the fifth epoch of Revelation.
Thank you, Gard.
Thank you. George,
Okay.
my friend.
I especially appreciated what you said about postmodernism. And I may be wrong, but it seems to me the primary tenet of postmodernism is there is no such thing as objective truth.
Only
And
interpretations. Only interpretations.
yeah, postmodernism also just has a different interpretation of myth, which is it's just a story. It's not really true. It's just a story. It can change at any time. And I'm thinking about the fifth epochal revelation when it says God dwells on paradise at the center of the universe. That I accept that as a literal truth. In other words, as an objective truth. It's not, to me, it's not a myth. It's not a story. And perhaps I'm not postmodern. Well, I am definitely not postmodern in any sense of the word. Well, at least I hope I'm not. But so how can Urantia Book progress in Western civilization if there's this attitude that there's no such thing as objective truth? So if I go up to somebody and say, well, God dwells at the center of the universe and he rules everything, and they go, well, that's just a story. So how do you get around that?
Well, I think you look at the Urantia Book for one, but the other is I take great consolation in Thomas Berry's The Universe Story. And I take great consolation in the reality that the postmodern moment, George, is not just existential philosophers who say that it's absurd and it's only interpretation and it's just a story. It's also the time of Albert Einstein and Max Planck. I mean, Planck's constant. Martin Rees says, I'll give you 6 numbers. Try to change them and you'll change everything in reality. But those are the constants by which reality functions. So this is all part of postmodernism as well, George. It's not just what you're saying. But I think the important thing for all of us to understand, as T.S. Eliot again said, is humility is important. So the images that we get from the Urantia revelation about paradise or about this or about that, we have to approach very humbly and very with curiosity and with a certain meekness and a realization, as the Urantia Book says, that this cosmology will shift, it will change. So again, the Urantia Book, I think, really solidifies the fact that there are facts and there is meaning and there are values which are objective. And that's why we have the Urantia revelation. But I think the supreme revelation of the book is the idea of personality. Tom Allen, how are you?
What I was wondering is, as I saw what you did for us, you brought us up through history, through the cosmological changes that have occurred through history, and the way that men think, and the way that women think, the way we all think, and progress. Now we know that progress is the watchword of the universe. Now, what I would like, we know that the Most Highs rule in the kingdoms of men. And we know that progress is the watchword of the universe. So my question for you is, are you working for the angels of the future? Because these, those are the projection angels who can forecast a future. So I would like to know what your forecast of the future is.
It's a great question, Tom, and thank you for the question. And what I would say is the Urantia Book says on 215 is every situation must be approached from the standpoint of origin, history, and destiny. So the future is a very important question. And what I would suggest is that we as a community need to spend a little more time with our history. And that's why I brought those 5 periods into our conversation, because I don't think we understand our history very well. And I think if we understood our history, if we understood why the postmodern period occurred and why we're in such a pickle right now and why my students are so depressed, at least until about midway through the semester when I really dose them with a lot of spiritual stuff. But we need to understand how we got to this place. And when we understand that, we'll understand why we have this revelation and why this revelation is so awesome. And again, what I project is that the principles of the universe, which are the cosmogenetic principles, I encourage everybody to read Thomas Berry's The Universe Story. There are lots of synonyms for those words. But unity, diversity, and growth are evolution. These are the principles that form the universe. And as you said, progress is the underlying theme of all of it. And so what I see is a culture of love, compassion, and hope emerging. And like the clouds in the sky that I saw this afternoon are just a few wisps of rain, of water, and will quickly dissipate. And behind those clouds is the reality of the sun. Now, I ask the group here and all those youth listening, what's greater, the reality of the sun or those few clouds? And so I see the sun coming, and I will quote the poet Hafiz, "By what strange miracle do I so often find that you do not smile?" And what I ask all of my students to do, Phil, you remember this from Unity Village, I ask them to dose. Dose every day. Dose everybody you can. Dose them with dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. How do you do that? You do it just the way you're doing it, George. You smile. You smile at every person. It makes you feel better, it improves your longevity, and it brings love, compassion, and hope into the world. And as I said earlier, it is joy that will turn the heads of people, not a recitation of facts.
Hope plus faith brings joy.
Exactly. You got it. And faith, we know from the Urantia book, is not a belief. Faith is the eightfold path of Jesus, which is humility, curiosity, patience and kindness, sincerity of heart. Those are the inner attitudes. The outer attitudes is a tenderheartedness that is willing to see the suffering of others and desires to relieve that suffering through compassion. And that compassion leads to action. So I encourage all of us who are alive in this moment to get going, to get action-oriented, compassion action-oriented. I just returned from Emory University that has started the Compassion Shift. There were representatives from every country on the planet there at Emory. Daniel Goleman, who is the father of emotional intelligence, was there. Arthur Brooks, who teaches the happiness class at Harvard Business School. Lisa Miller, who wrote The Awakened Brain. All of these incredible scientific minds gathering to proclaim that compassion and love, as the Dalai Lama said, are not luxuries, they are necessities. And we have millions of people now who are taking compassion training. And compassion, like any skill set, is not something you can just say and be. You have to train yourself in it. And so that's what Jesus was doing in the Eightfold Path of the Beatitudes, which leads to a little misunderstanding, and we're going to get plenty of that in times to come.
Okay, from actually this one was from Brad. Regarding mythology, what are important stories in the Urantia book Cosmologies? Stories that can help our cynical postmodern culture. Jesus, of course, others. I often think of Van and Amadon, but can you give any other examples that come immediately to mind?
Jesus was filled with metaphors. He was a proclamation of symbolic language. All I have to do is say prodigal son and good Samaritan, and you get it. So his way of explaining cosmology, his way of explaining reality, was a series of metaphorical tales. So what I suggest all of us start learning how to do is how to learn how to tell a parable. And I suggest all of us are challenged in the language of metaphor. All of us think of myth as fiction and not reality. But Jesus was telling us, I'm going to give you the greatest of all realities, and I'm going to give it to you in the language of metaphor and myth.
Before he died, Ed Owen, I was involved with him in writing parables. And it is a fantastic experience. If you've never sat down and written a parable out, it is really, really fantastic. And then the other thing I'll say, Gard, about myth is that recently I did a podcast with Santiago Neeland, and we talked about myth because we're trying to relate to the younger folks. And so we talked about Star Wars, and we talked about Joseph Campbell and myth, and how important myth is in our lives. And it was amazing how many young people accessed that podcast afterwards. And how they began to relate, the idea about Luke seeking redemption, and all those, those kind of archetypes that Lucas brought to Star Wars because of Campbell, and how powerful myth can be in our lives when we really internalize it. We really think about it and how to use it and what it means in our relationship with other people, particularly. So, those have been my two recent sort of experiences that I wanted to share. But we are very close to our end. And so, does anybody else have anything else they wish to add?
I want to just for the record, I want to say, let's spend a little more time with cosmology. Let's spend a little more time studying the history of thought. Let's spend a little more time understanding the metaphors. Let's spend a little more time creating the metaphors, because that, Tom, is the future. And you are a bard. You are a musical bard. So you know about metaphors, you know about lyrics, and you know how those lyrics can really shift our awareness. I just heard a wonderful song by a Western singer named John Lynch called The Victim Tree. And it's really beautiful. It's really worth listening to. So again, what I suggest is that all of us should become more poetic in our expression and more appreciative of our ancestors. We just celebrated El Dia de los Muertes, the Day of the Dead, which I will take every day over Halloween, which is a ritual of fear. And although I do see some nice little outfits that people put on, but I will say the Day of the Dead is an honoring of our predecessors. And I think we need to spend a little more time honoring Sir Isaac Newton, Rene Descartes, John Locke, all of the great ones, Ptolemy, who have given us this platform upon which we stand.